Hi all, so today let's talk about Luxembourg Bohemia, so the history of Bohemia during the 14th century, and this great chapter of low medieval history that sees the Bohemian lands becoming essentially, from a political and cultural point of view, the very center of the European world. Really in many ways. And the story of Bohemia is, I don't see it told very much or known in popular culture, but this is some of the most important lands of Central Europe, which saw indeed not just during the medieval era, but also especially during the modern one and even contemporary history, a great important and a great role, especially from a cultural point of view, starting exactly from medieval times, from the low Middle Ages, and it's the story of a political and territorial entity that really has had its own coherence. It was conceived as a unified kingdom, in spite of the various degrees of medieval political weakness, at least. Confronted with the ones of the modern, especially contemporary eras. But we have essentially this block, this oval area, very very extended into the very center of Europe, between Germany, Austria, and Poland. That has also a national identity, proto-national perhaps during the Middle Ages. These were Slavic areas that essentially began to emerge as national entities exactly during this time. The 14th century is in many ways a moment of strengthening of the so-called national monarchies, and definitely Bohemia really was. But it's also a moment of great inner transformation. It wasn't also a purely Slavic country, as we will be seeing. There were communities coming of people coming from many parts of Europe, mostly the German lands, and it was a kingdom that, exactly because of its central position in the heart of Europe, was was exposed to the influences of many different cultures. And it was also placed quite strategically well, let's say, in terms of in respects to trade routes, for instance. But this is something we're gonna see in detail for now. And before talking about Luxembourg Bohemia, it's necessary to give a minimal background. Bohemia was born as a kingdom before the Luxembourg dynasty. That was, by the way, a French dynasty, so it hadn't much to do, originally speaking, with Bohemia. Bohemia had risen as such, let's say, taking its name from the classical antiquity of Boiahenum, so the region of the Boi, who were an ancient Celtic tribe inhabiting the areas of today's Czech Republic, in fact, and part of Austria, as well as other lands, Slovakia, etc. By the way, the borders of Bohemia at that time weren't really exactly the ones of today's Czech Republic, as they weren't one of the bordering countries. Take Poland, Germany, or Hungary. There were areas that were, especially on the borders and the frontiers, were quite unstable, and there was a lot of infighting between all these various entities. However, since a very long time, Bohemia had risen as a power under the dynasty of the Přemyslids. The Přemyslids were a Slavic dynasty coming from Přemyslid, which is in today's Poland, telling the truth. But that tells you how the Slavic Central and Eastern Europe was quite interconnected already at the time. Eventually, the Přemyslids, we're talking about, there's a very mythical origin of this dynasty. We don't know much about them, but we can be almost sure that from the second half of the 9th century, so we are in Carolingian times even, the ancestors of the Premyslids actually already ruled over Bohemia. Now these were lands that, as we were saying, were populated by Slavic tribes that at the time were a very quite fluid system within Europe. Many Slavic tribes, even the ones that eventually would give the name to certain volcanic regions, etc., had not yet moved to those places. They really resembled much still a situation typical of the migration era. Eastwards of Bohemia, there was obviously the Carolingian Germany, that too, before the Carolingian conquest, was still rather fluid. You can still talk about a sort of semi-nomadic Germany at the time. Then eventually, with the Carolingian models that are imported into Germany, the Germans are largely sedentary at this point, and they start building a society that quite, tends to push eastwards. And the Premyslids at that time, in fact, were influenced definitely by the Carolingians, and Bohemia is one of those regions that, from the Low Middle Ages, in spite not being German, enters to be part officially of the Holy Roman Empire. That tells you how, in spite of being Slavs, these peoples were how close they were to the Western European manners, and in turn how much they were influenced by Frankish Germanic culture, let's say. So the Premyslids rose as a dynasty that claimed in this rather still egalitarian and primitive Slavic society as the first, conceived in Slavic perspective, like in the Germanic one, first among equals in theory. But over the generations, over the centuries, they managed to build something more centralized. And this is very interesting because while Western Europe was going progressively stratified, socially speaking, by feudalism, the Slavic lands were at large still very resembling of the ancient tribal asset of the Germanic and Slavic world. So there weren't very strong aristocracies compared to the Western one, and for one rising to a certain level of power, it was rather easy to keep under control all the various others, because they didn't have such strongly rooted feudal estates like it was happening in the Frankish world, and therefore a certain degree of centralization was feasible in these Slavic lands. This is very interesting because it's a tradition that in a certain way strengthened the certain characteristics of those countries. For instance, it's a bit paradoxical, that lands like the one of Bohemia or Poland and Hungary would retain an elective system, but at the same time they wouldn't have such a strong feudal organization like the ones of Western Europe, and this would influence later history, and especially in the 14th century this will facilitate in a certain way the introduction of foreign dynasties like the ones of the Luxembourg into the Bohemian soil. Now the Premyslids are able in the 13th century to rise to a position of great preeminence in Central Europe. Especially after the end of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, the Holy Roman Empire had undergone a process of political disgregation that affected a bit all the German lands, while the Kingdom of Bohemia, that remember was part of the Holy Roman Empire, institutionally speaking, was essentially solid, because within it the Permislid dynasty had maintained a centralized rule, and the extinction of the Hohenstaufen in the German lands wasn't something that weakened them. On the contrary, the Bohemia at that point would be the stronger a political entity existing within the Holy Roman Empire. And this would mean that the Permislids began to expand within the same Germany. With Ottokar II, we have the Permislids taking over a huge amount of lands, including the Austrian domains that had belonged to the Babenberg dynasty that went extincted, Styria, Carinthia, so a great part of today's Austria, and even parts of northeastern Italy. And they began to they rose to such a power that they basically were one of the major powers in Europe at the time, and especially in the Central European area that was really divided in many ways. Poland wasn't that strong. Hungary had seen a series of dynastic problems, even though it was a fierce enemy of Bohemia, and it would continue to be so. Germany was fragmented, so the Permislids became a sort of parallel kingdom, in not just by name, but also by fact within the Holy Roman Empire, that was risking not to see a Slavicization of Germany, but definitely a subjugation of the German kingdom by the Bohemian one. So the Bohemians at this point signed with the wealth system in Europe. So this system that was embodied by the Pope and Capetingian France, that were at that time at the peak of their power, having defeated the Swabians. And Germany, and the reason why the Permislids joined the wealth system wasn't much, of a belief, of a creed. As Slavs, they had remained relatively distant to the developments occurring in Western Europe, but the problem was that in Swabia at the time, the Hohenstaufen had been replaced with the Habsburgs. Rudolf of Habsburg basically managed to become king of the Romans and expand his power instead as a Ghibelline force, so trying to reunite the Ghibellines scattered all over the Roman Empire, in Germany as well as in Italy, to fight against the wealth bloc. And this power rising into Germany would be obviously seen as a threat from Ottokar II, king of Bohemia, and a war would start. Actually, two wars start in 1276 and 78, for which Rudolf of Habsburg, especially with the Battle of Markfeld, in which Ottokar was killed, managed to take away from the Permislids all the territories that they had gained in Central Europe, including Austria. This is, by the way, the moment in which the Habsburgs settle in Austria. And Bohemia essentially shrinks territorially back to its original, let's say, borders. And at the end of the 13th century, the Habsburgs, against any expectation, managed to rise as a great power in Central Europe. At the point, the Permislids are still there, but the Habsburgs managed to secure the Bohemian Crown and even the Polish one, so it's a huge power. And the French king Philip IV was very worried about this, because initially he had supported the rise of the Habsburgs in Central Europe to better manage the German scenario, but the incredible rise of the Habsburgs at certain point worries even him. And therefore, the French are at this point the Kingdom of France is the most powerful kingdom existing in Europe. It has starting to have some trouble at the beginning of the 14th century. The Acme had been the second half of the 13th century, and since the Premyslid dynasty had gone extinguished in 1306, and the Habsburgs seem at this point unstoppable, Philip IV of France backs a French count that was part of the Holy Roman Empire, by the way, because the Holy Roman Empire did comprehend also French territories. That is Henry of Luxembourg. Luxembourg was this, relatively small political entity that flourished into the western side of the Holy Roman Empire in a very highly feudalized area, so in a very western context. And what happens is that not only Henry of Luxembourg is elected King of the Romans and eventually Holy Roman Emperors as Henry VII, but he also manages to get the Bohemian Crown. It was a very, we don't have time to get into the details, but basically the Bohemian Crown was offered to him, obviously with a great diplomatical and political effort to grant this counter element to the Habsburgs. So by forming into the German lands the Holy Roman Empire, another dynasty that could contrast the Habsburgic expansion. And therefore the Bohemian nobility, by the way, accepts this new dynasty, and this is not to be seen as a surprising process, because obviously having an external king wasn't perceived much as a threat. On the contrary, it was aimed in many ways and accepted as as a sort of equilibrate situation. The idea that there is someone external, so that therefore doesn't have, at least initially, particular favoritisms, and that is able to to judge impartially, but you have always to think that there is this very influent aristocracy that is gaining a lot of power. Bohemia during the Premyslid times had seen a progressive effort from the ruling dynasty to centralize the power by giving power to the cities, not differently from what the German emperors had done to counter the push of German princes, and therefore to centralize, to even create a bureaucracy, a middle-class bureaucracy, etc. Because Bohemia at that point was starting to be also quite feudalized under German influence. So feudalism, in a certain sense, starts flourishing, even if in less developed forms, but not definitely weaker forms, into the Bohemian lands. Bohemia was the most highly German-influenced Slavic land at this point, together with Western Poland, but Bohemia especially because it had always been part of the imperial system. It had also entered often into the political matters of the empire. It had participated to civil wars during the struggle for investitures. I mean, the Germans were there, and the same Premyslids had been using a lot of German mercenaries in their armies because they didn't trust their own Bohemian lords, and it wasn't such a bad thing. The prejudice against mercenaries is something that we largely have from the Romantic era, but sometimes mercenaries would be the better choice, also because these nobles had done many revolts against the king, the Bohemian kings, and therefore they reacted by, you know, distrusting obviously the nobility. At this point, you have to think that the Luxembourgs rise to an immense power, because they basically did what others had already done. We had seen the Habsburgs, that were these small, you know, count family coming from Switzerland and Swabia, that at a certain point takes in block the whole Austria, so in the east. Then you have the Luxembourgs, who are this French dynasty at the borders of the western borders of the empire, that takes over Bohemia and builds its fortune there. Then even the Angevins would do the same thing with Hungary. So there is this parallelism between these three dynasties that is very fascinating. And these systems were incredibly powerful, because, you know, for a situation in Europe where the average was being you know, a feudal lord with dominion scattered, you know, all over a certain region and in constant dialectics, where it was a political, diplomatical, military dialectic with the surrounding neighbors, having a wall solid block of an entire kingdom, especially with much higher degrees of centralization compared to what was happening in the West, was an extraordinary opportunity, and the Luxembourgs really made the best out of it. The Habsburgs were at that point not as much powerful as them, because they had not inherited a kingdom, they had inherited the Duchy of Austria and then Styria, Carinthia, and the Slavic Mark, plus other territories to which they were expanding, like Tyrol, while the Luxembourgs had a whole kingdom, and plus all other territories scattered all over the empire, because you don't have to see that as if, you know, the Luxembourgs just had Bohemia and their homelands. These were such powerful families that they basically had their hands into everything, and they had inherited and purchased and conquered other lands scattered all over Germany. If you see the political map of Germany during this time, you have this completely massive scenario, into which, by the way, these dynasties, like the one of the Habsburgs, the Luxembourgs, the Wettins, began, and the Wittelsbach, for instance, began to give a more rational asset. But the situation was so deeply intricate, complicated, that, you know, the political geography would be still pretty much disordered. And Harry VII, as is mostly remembered, he didn't rule very much on Bohemia, because at that point imperial authority, although declining, so this last you know, this last display of strength, for which Henry, has Kingdom of the Romans, basically descends into Italy and makes his Rome-Fahrt, so his journey to Rome, to be crowned emperor. And the descent into Italy of Henry is a very important. It's probably one the last important imperial expedition of the medieval age into Italy, and it does achieve some results, because at that point Italy had been hegemonized by the Papal and French Angevin bloc. There were just a few Ghibellines existing, and asking obviously the emperor to come back into Italy and to give them aid and support. And Harry descends into Italy. So, and after decades of Angevin preeminence into Italy after the defeat of the Hohenstaufen. He manages to recompact all the imperial front, especially into northern Italy, by backing the major Italian Ghibelline families that were the Visconti of Milan and the della Scala in the Trevisan Mark in northeastern Italy. And he even manages to make an expedition into Tuscany. He puts even Florence under siege for many months. He's not able to take it, and then he comes back into Pisa, and it was a Ghibelline city at the time, and he plans to launch an offensive on the Angevin kingdom of Naples, so trying to recover the ancient Hohenstaufen dominions of Sicily, and instead he died of malaria in Tuscany suddenly. So the whole expedition achieves relatively few of what it could have been potentially, and so you see that this happens in the first years of the after which he had gained the Bohemian Crown. So at that point he couldn't achieve much in there, but it's his son John that starts ruling over Bohemia, and it's not an easy rule, because John of Luxembourg quarrels with Bohemian nobility. John was also, it was a very troubled king rule, let's say. He wasn't also much of a great statesman. He preferred to go into chivalric military adventures all over Europe, and it's still very important, however, because it tells you how much Bohemia at this point was interconnected with Italy, France, Germany, etc., and by how so many influxes coming from the rest of Europe really contributed to enrich the Bohemian culture that was being developed during those years. By the way, under the Przemyslids, Prague had already been a great city, a center of the arts, of trade, so there was already the base to build that, and the Luxembourgs had this very big potential. And John, by the way, also attempts another expedition into Italy. That, however, is something much smaller than the one of his father, because he's basically called by an Italian city, Brescia, in in Lombardy, because this city feared to be conquered by the della Scala family that had the imperial vicary, as a matter of fact, into Italy at that time. So he comes into Italy trying to build a sort of lordship on his own, and that tells you how messed up at that point already the Guelph and Ghibelline dichotomy is, in the sense that they were fighting one against each other, even between Guelphs and Ghibellines themselves, and he fought into Italy. He managed to create telling the truth, a very big dominion into the center of the Po Valley, but it was something that could be possible just because the relative Italian cities were feared to be annexed by certain lordships, basically entrusted him this the resources and means, and obviously these German emperors take all they can, even contracting very high debts with the Italians, and essentially by drying out all the few resources that had remained in the hands of the free cities who were calling for help against major and more aggressive Italian lordships. that were quite on the rise, by the way, and exactly because the imperial power was fading out in Italy, so they basically had no police checking what they were doing. And at this time, John, and he was however mainly fighting in Italy with the papal legatus. At this time, the Pope has moved from Italy and rules from Avignon in France. Henry VII had been called by Celestine V, Pope, into Italy to put an end to the the fights against Welfs and Ghibellines. Now the papal legatus is instead fighting against John, he and same legatus, by the way, was at that time a bit out of reach of the same local of the same papal power, because he was trying to build a dominion into the central Po Valley, just like John was trying to do. So you understand, it's a very strong moment of decadence, both for the empire and the papacy, in terms of effective political control on the on the European matters, because what happened into Italy, by the way, affected strongly anything else happening in Western Europe. So this was very important as an indicator, of political strands, etc. And together with John went also his son Charles, the future Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor, the famous one of the Golden Bull, etc. And he had been already associated as to power in the 30s of the 14th century by John, and who fought into Italy this stage. He began to know the place, because he would come back into a military expedition into Italy, by the way, to be crowned emperor eventually in after 20 years. However, the Italian journey of the Luxembourgs ends essentially because of events taking place in Germany, especially the Wittelsbachs with Ludwig of Bavaria began to aggress the Luxembourgs of Bohemia. So the situation is such for which both John and Charles abandon Italy and come back into their homeland, and they keep these very intense keep up this very intense fight that were taking place into Germany at the time between the Habsburgs, the Wittelsbachs, their own Luxembourg family. A very messy situation, probably in certain senses more messy than the Italian one. So at that point, however, the Luxembourgs still have ties with the French crown that had supported their and kept supporting their rule into Central Europe to counter the other German princes. And it's very interesting that John and Charles participate to the Battle of Crécy. Charles, John had, it's very interesting because John, King of Bohemia, was blind at that time, so it was very interesting because he went fighting to the Battle of Crécy blind. He got blind by a crusade that made into the Baltic. I'm very interested to stress how far-reaching the influence of the of Luxembourg Bohemia was, because the Bohemian dynasts since the Przemysl times had often joined the Germans into their northern crusades of the Baltic. So it was a sort of tradition for a Bohemian king at the time to go making a crusade into the Baltic. and that's where John got blind, and he went fighting for the French army, French royal army at Crécy in 46, and um, John dies in battle. We have this. It was a very, the Luxembourgs were French, and this means that they had a very strong chivalric ideal. John had been raised in Paris, by the way, so they deeply felt these chivalric customs and the idea of fighting till the very end. So John dies into the battle against the English by, sweeping his sword in front of him furiously, without even being able, in fact, to see who was hitting, and died heroically in this way. Also, Charles participated to the battle, and after his father's death, he, however, came back to Bohemia and was elected as emperor, definitely, of the Holy Roman Empire. At this time, that the Holy Roman Empire was an elective title. You were chosen by the German princes. So the fact that one would be chosen emperor during this time was a very complex, the result of a very complex sum of factors, and it mostly, it hadn't mostly, it was a sort of double-edged sword, because normally the German princes would try to elect someone who was not too powerful in order to counter those who were too powerful. But the problem is that when the less powerful were were elected emperors, they would become more powerful, and therefore there is all this balance. Then think about political corruption, huge sums of money paid to the various electors, and wars waged, etc. And it was a very messy and very highly fluid system. But as we were saying, the Bohemian lands made a very stable, at least compared to very stable property, or at least relatively to other imperial lands. And Charles, as King of Bohemia and Holy Roman Emperor, makes an outstanding job. Charles IV of Luxembourg remains in our historical memory as one of the greatest statesmen of the Middle Ages, one of the greatest rulers, and he manages to achieve a lot of results from his capital of Prague. First of all, he, relatively to his reign, he sought the support of the high nobility. He decided to play this card. However, he also strongly and very energically worked in order to strengthen royal power. So something that wasn't really seen pretty well by the nobility, and by especially increasing the prestige and the individuality of his kingdom. We can't really say that Luxembourg Bohemia became the center of Europe at the time. It was the center of a very powerful political entity that ruled over very vast dominions all over Central Europe. We are at the mid of the 14th century, so France is engulfed at this point with the 100 Years' Wars. It got this terrible defeat of Crécy. So the same territorial unity of France starts crumbling. The English reacquire formerly owned land on the French soil, and we can say that French monarchy is in crisis. Poland is divided, Germany is divided, Italy is divided. So what you have in the center of Europe is this, instead, this very strong body that obviously doesn't have to be exaggerated, but considering in its power, I mean, but considering what was the rest of Europe like, definitely you can argue that Prague became the center of Europe in many ways, politically speaking, culturally speaking, and Charles managed to really make this coming true. It wasn't something, that expected or predictable, nothing to be taken for granted. It was a very strong political action. First of all, among other things, he gained the independence of the Bohemian Church with the constitution of a new archdiocese that was the one of Prague. This was extremely important in medieval times, to have an ecclesiastical center from which, directing the local religious as well as administrative matters. We know how the church was, and the clergy was important in the Middle Ages, because it produced this body of very skilled and illiterate bureaucrats that had studied and knew the letters, etc., especially during this time. And the archbishopric obviously meant that beyond the Pope, the archbishop would be in the local affairs, especially on a regional scale, like normally the archbishopric was created for. It could really have a huge influence, and not depending on other archbishops, because it could happen quite easily that there would be certain political entities in feudal Europe that were quite powerful, but yet they depended ecclesiastically by archbishoprics that existed in other territories. So Prague becomes an archbishop seat, and this brings a great deal of autonomy in religious matters, but also in political matters. Meant that the ecclesiastical power could be used, for instance, to counter the one of the high nobility, especially because bishops can be named, and they don't have dynasties on their own, so you can place on those seats people who are faithful to your rule, and praying really on that. And Prague becomes really the center of European culture, with the foundation in 1348 of the first Transalpine university, east of the Rhine. So the first university of Central Europe is the one of Prague. I think that major cultural centers of Europe have always remained since then: Rome, Paris, and Prague, even during the contemporary era. And this conferred obviously a great importance, because a university wasn't just a way to acquire money, because of all the students, sometimes very rich students, or at least all the times very rich students could pay for living in Prague, for spending in Prague, therefore, and attracting teachers and scholars, but also and especially by using these human resources, let's say, to draw from this university community very highly skilled bureaucrats and scholars and people who could help to build a state, administratively speaking, culturally speaking. Think about the Luxembourg court of Prague and how wealthy that was. It was already wealthy in the 13th century. In the 14th century it becomes something enormous, and And Prague, in this sense, becomes also the heart of European culture, because it's very open to Italians, to the French, to the Germans, so to areas that were quite highly culturally developed. In Italy, you find that humanism is taking place. Petrarch would go as a diplomat in Prague. There was the Library of Prague was quite important. So a lot of humanists that start also bringing new ideas, new knowledge into Prague, and think how really important this pole practically became. And all this was comforted by the very long reign of Charles IV. This must also not be overlooked. It was very rare for a sovereign to rule so long as Charles. He had become emperor in 1346. He died in 1378. And this is very politically important to have the time to achieve certain goals, certain political goals, and to carry out a policy that can have a continuity and bear its own fruits. And together with this, you find that there is a very high economical expansion of Bohemia. And you can understand that from new social and cultural forces that began to appear in the political scene, and these would be looked up very favorably, especially by the son of Charles, Wenceslaus, when he became king of Bohemia, and through changing the father's policy that so instead favorably the high nobility, he chose for his courts some new men. They were called in this way in Latin homines novi, who were drawn from the bourgeoisie, so from this middle class, and from the lower nobility. So people who had everything to who had less to lose than the high nobles, and would be very willing to rise their social status by becoming faithful to the king. And obviously the high nobility was not very happy of this, because they had tolerated the increase of power of the Bohemian monarchs during Charles, but now they saw themselves being substituted by people coming from a lower social stand, and they didn't like this. So the high Bohemian high aristocracy joined into the so-called League of Lords, and for a certain period it managed to regain the control of the executive into the kingdom. And this brought to a moment of political instability that brings partially also to the decline of Bohemia, because the royal cities that were these cities were granted rights by the kings, so that were seen as we have seen the counterbalance to noble to the feudal landed aristocracy. These cities began to revolt, and together with those who in Prague had been faithful to the royal rule. And at the end of this clash between the king and his own adversaries, there is an agreement that, however, didn't really stop this competition between the various social classes. So the political situation remained quite fluid, and it was complicated by certain cultural and religious unrests, let's say, ferments that were taking place. Also because in parallel we arrived at the beginning of the 15th century of the with the religious schism of the West, with the creation of various popes and anti-popes, for which the various countries of Europe sided with one or the other in order to pursue their own individual interests. And under Wenceslaus, in fact, there are the first signs of the Hussites movement that do not break up exactly at this point, but there is the idea that something is changing also in the political sensibility, the religious and spiritual sensibility, and also through the awareness that that Bohemia was the Bohemians were sort of a nation at that point, and therefore all the causes that would bring eventually to the Hussite revolts, and during the Great Western Schism, Wenceslaus sided with in 1409 with the cardinals that had joined in Pisa, where not just two popes, was elected even a third pope to the ones that had been already elected, with the name of Alexander V. We have this time in history where three popes at once, all against the other, and this choice of Wenceslaus was opposed in Prague by the Archbishop and by the German scholars of the German masters of the city university. And this was very important because it tells you, first of all, how much what could happen in a side of Europe could really bring to very important consequences on another side. So the greater interconnection of the European continent at this point, especially politically speaking. Secondly, how high was the presence of foreigners in Bohemia? Now, Bohemia had seen a very strong immigration of Western elements. There were people coming literally from everywhere, from Germany mostly, France, Italy, England. These had been usually during Premislid times knights would be enfeoffed into Bohemia to be faithful to the king and against the nobility, and there had always been, especially during the Drang nach Ost, so the expansion of the German world toward Eastern Europe, groups of Germans, especially German merchants, settling into areas of Bohemia. So Bohemia at this point, like most of Central and Eastern Europe, was a very highly multicultural land. And we find the highest echelons of the Bohemian cultural world, these German masters that evidently had come from more educated areas of the empire, from Bohemia, that was, it had this court and this center, but it wasn't otherwise an extremely developed country, and it mostly resented from the Western cultural models. And how the German presence had risen to power even within the royal court. After all, the same Luxembourgs were were French, so they were foreigners for the Bohemians. But Wenceslaus, which is a very Slavic name, and this also, through the names you have to understand even the politics that these people did. It's very interesting to see in the Middle Ages how, calling yourself or letting be called by certain communities in a way would essentially tell you what was your favor towards them. Wenceslaus at this point, with the revolt in Prague, he entrusted the institutional places of responsibility of the Prague University to Czechs, not to the Germans. So we're talking about at every level. So not just the masters, but also the students, the personnel that kept the university. And therefore there is a sort of exodus of Germans, of the German intelligentsia from Prague at this point. And the Czech intellectuals, on the contrary, rise to a very important level, and they became, a very important and integrant component of a broader movement that was always more inclined towards a national direction of the Bohemian kingdom, that would have eventually found on the religious plan its most evident expression. So this is the moment in which Bohemia, in a certain sense, starts gaining that proto-national or even national identitarism that would bring her to revolt against the German dominion. At a certain point, that for dynastic reasons Bohemia falls into the hands of various other foreign dynasties, eventually at the end during the modern age under the Habsburgs, and one of the triggering reason of the triggering cause of the 30 Years' War would be in fact the revolt of Prague. It starts a period between the late medieval and the early modern age into which Bohemia strongly struggles to be, really something on its own, something like a real nation, and gain independence. And the Hussites Wars would be some of the most ferocious struggles for the Bohemian independence. However, this belongs to another chapter that we will have to examine thoroughly in another occasion. There would really be a lot more to say about the Luxembourgs. The Luxembourgs at this point, after Wenceslaus, the successor is Sigismund. Then after him in 1437, basically that branch dies out, and Bohemia falls into Habsburgic hands. The golden age of the Luxembourgs was really the 14th century, and what it was mostly interesting to say today is to make you understand the importance of Bohemia and of Prague in the political and cultural development of low medieval Europe. These would be lands that these were lands that would remain very important within all the European history, and think about Bohemian literature and culture and lifestyle, how deeply they affected European and Western identity throughout the modern age, the contemporary era, and we have to thank in a way both the Promyslids and the Luxembourgs for having put the premises of this to be possible, and by having created a kingdom that wasn't merely a military power, but something deeper, something that was pushing towards a statal form, that was aware of the importance of culture, of the letters, and that was very cleverly administered. And we will coming back, however, on the on Bohemia. Also during this video period on my videos. So here we make an hour of video. I hope it was interesting to hear. As always, if you like this video, please feel free to share it, or to like it, or to subscribe to my channel to receive further contents. And as always, I thank you for listening. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.